of understanding of how I need to adapt my learning experiences to the programs that I'm working with. And the one thing that I've become cognizant of as an instructor is how do I then create an experience in an online format for students who are first generation, for students who have learning disabilities, but also for students who may have, mixed experiences with technology. And the one thing that I go back to is thinking of a time when, you had a good experience academically, or when you engaged in a presentation, or you talked to colleagues, or you got a promotion and you were successful, and that serotonin rush and how that made you feel about yourself, or a time when you had a failure, and how that changed your context for yourself, particularly if you didn't expect it, and how did those experiences impact yourself, feelings about yourself, and your ability to do things. And so it's always worth kind of contextualizing that self for yourself as you're instructing students, because we've had students, particularly as of late in these past few years, who've had some experiences where they've been removed from the classroom environment. They haven't had those opportunities to build that sense of self-efficacy. They haven't necessarily had the same instructional rigor that they may, students may typically have experienced, say, 5-10 years ago. And so how do we then start thinking about building a student sense of themselves, getting them to be more successful in the classroom environment? And Albert Bandura's defines self-efficacy as students' belief that they can be successful on a task in front of them by being able to produce a certain result. And researchers have since explored how that belief is domain and task specific. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can build in practices and pedagogy into your classroom structure that will allow you to help students start to perceive and contextualize themselves as having some of those skills and create momentum so that they become invested in their own success. So Bandura and his colleagues, through the research that they did, were able to demonstrate that students, if they perceived that they were capable of doing something, that was a predictor of positive outcomes and engagement. So if they did a task and it went reasonably well, they got reinforced, or they got good instruction as to how to remediate that and were given the opportunity to do so, that started to build their sense of self-confidence. And they talk a little bit about what the academic mindset is for a student who's coming in. Now, for students such as myself in the undergraduate situation, there's a sense of imposter syndrome, even navigating an undergraduate degree when you're a first generation student, particularly if you have a family who my family fortunately did value academics, but sometimes you'll be navigating, supporting students whose family may not value academics, may not see this as something that has a substantive outcome for them. And so how do you identify for those students that they belong in the community? How do you create conversations so that they can feel a sense of being incorporated, and making sure that you're using inclusive language? And then also, doing things like creating prompts at the start of a semester saying, could you tell me an introductory prompt or an email prompt about 2 concerns that you have about being successful in this class, and getting students to explain to you what that might look like for them, what their experiences might be. And sometimes you'll get students who it's far more a concern about access to technology, or they have family responsibilities or things like that. But just giving them the opportunity to be able to express that to you, and then using supportive language to say that you're going to be with them on this journey, will often get students just saying, okay, I can regroup, I can do this. And then also getting students to understand, by giving them constructive feedback, that their ability and competence grow with the level of effort that they put in. And then creating a context for the work that you're giving them. Now, I will be honest, I teach in rehabilitation and human services. And so I am able to create a lot of context for the students that I work with in terms of not only academically, but looking at professional outcomes for them so that they can feel vested in the work that they're doing. But there are ways in which you can think about how you engage with students. And so Bandura, in a very wordy way, talked about how people can develop their own sense of personal agency. So how do you give students a sense of autonomy, that they can make a difference, that they can contribute? Well, you can create some constructive assignments where they can utilize the class resources, but you can also create opportunities. Like, I've talked to people who teach science classes, and what they've done is they've embedded the science instruction, not only in an in-person context, but put the online lectures on. And what we've been able to identify is the metrics of students going back to those lectures and replaying vital parts of the lectures so that they can embed the instruction, and think about it intellectually. And so you'll get a lot of professors who get invested in the idea that if they haven't heard it the first time, well, that's up to them. But if you can find ways to incorporate instruction in not only a written way, but in a verbal way, it will give students the opportunity to revisit that instruction and make sure that they're learning it. And students who are keen to do that will engage. So building self-efficacy has been shown to have a direct impact on academic achievement, and can be positively correlated to students' self-regulated learning strategies. And so as students start to build momentum and get a sense of self-direction, they will start planning their work. They will reach out to you if they miss an assignment, and they will think about this. And the way I'm going to put context for this is when I came to MSU Billings, I had limited interaction with online instruction. And the first semester I taught a class here, I didn't do a great job. And what was a revelation for me was I talked with a student who worked in our trio offices, who also took one of my classes. And she said, the way your classes are designed, it's like we're teaching ourselves. You've put in a lot of readings, you put in a lot of discussion boards, you put in a lot of written assignments, but I never saw you once. I don't know who you are. I have no sense of connection with you. And so then I really had to start thinking about how can I make sure that I'm embedding myself into this class, that I'm offering videos, that I'm offering in-class lectures, because it really did create a fundamental shift for me in how I offered my online instruction. And with that, if students start to feel like they've been successful on a task, like you give them an opportunity to do an assignment and give them rich feedback, then they'll definitely become invested in moving that forward. Ways in which you can create mastery experiences is guided practice. So giving students specific instructions. So like in all my classes, I have embedded videos about how to go online into the MSUB library, find a paper, use research terms, and be able to utilize that information to write a paper. I've also shown them where you can find the citation mark and print off the citation or copy off the citation to embed in a paper. And so these are things that I have found students have really mixed experiences with. Sometimes you'll have students who've done some of that kind of work in a K through 12 situation, but a lot of them haven't. Where do they go to get that instruction? And then offering a celebration of exceptional work, making sure that students feel reinforced when they're navigating that. I also talk about offering students warm up, and I do a lot of scaffolding in my classes. And so what that means is when I do my first assignments for the semester, I tend to have those class scores at a lower level, because what I've also seen is that sometimes students will catastrophize and become less invested if there's a high grade assignment within the first 4 weeks of a class and they do poorly on it. I have seen, and there's data to support, that students will disengage with the class if that happens early. And so creating opportunities for students to receive feedback and instruction from me, and then build on that, and then create and scale the scoring that I give them, so that as they go through the class, I grade higher and higher and higher, but that's based on them understanding what my expectations are. And then they start to see, okay, the grades, I am building on the grades, this is becoming instructive. But because the scores are scaled, if they don't do great in that first couple of assignments, it doesn't matter. Those aren't going to make a substantive difference to their ability to make progress in the class. And I emphasize that to the class in its entirety. And then the other thing that's been really interesting for me, and this I've worked in both urban and rural environments. So before I came here, I worked at Virginia Commonwealth University. And what I have learned is that although we take for granted that all students have had experiences with technology, what their experiences is vastly differs. So even though it seems like it's a ubiquitous experience, it really isn't. Some students have had experiences with online platforms, but the majority really don't know what they're doing. And so how do you as instructors create opportunities for students to learn how to navigate those platforms? Do you have videos? Do you do an introductory message that tells students, here's where you're going to find your assignments, here's where you go to do this? Or are they spending the first month figuring that out? Because for some students, if they're taking 4 or 5 classes, the learning curve is going to be bigger. This stuff isn't always intuitive for students. And so making sure that the expectations, the boundaries around the class are clearly understood is really important at that first beginning class. In my class, everything, all my assignments, everything is embedded week by week. And so I try to make it as intuitive for students as possible so that they don't have to hunt and peck. When I worked at VCU, one of the things we did some research on is if anyone goes onto a website and has to click more than 3 times to find anything, they stop looking. And so I apply this principle into my classes as well, so that students only have to go to one place to find all of the information they need from week to week. And I embed it all there to make it more intuitive. So just think about, how do you offer information about that? How do you explain where they need to go for different sources when they're navigating an online learning platform? I also think it's really important not only to make sure that there's written explanations, but videos as well. So you'll see, and I know there's a mixed bag in terms of how students evaluate faculty, but for the purposes of today, you'll see that students often rank faculty higher when they have in-person classes with them, because they feel a sense of connection with that faculty member and they appreciate the instruction that they receive. And so we as faculty can also create those opportunities in an online format if we're willing to engage and create online lectures, create interactive opportunities. The first time I tried to do this, though, I created an office hours, and I sat looking at my screen for the best part of an hour because nobody came. And what I learned is that I needed to embed instructional opportunities into my classes on a weekly basis to talk about the class content, and then offer up for 20 minutes after the class, I will have office hours. If you have any questions, if you want to touch base with me, this is a good time to do it. And then suddenly I had a lot of students who would stay on after the lecture, ask me questions, engage with me, and be willing to, take those few minutes to say, hey, this is what I have going on. Hey, I'm working on this assignment. I don't really understand it. Can you help me? And it really changed how I engage with students and how they were able to identify their concerns to me. And so just thinking about how to be more creative about that type of stuff has fundamentally changed for me the way I engage with students, particularly undergrad students, because graduate students tend to be more self-directed, whereas undergrad students need that scaffolding. Okay, so the other thing to be aware of is if students have vicarious experiences where they learn watching someone else having success on a task, that can be helpful as well. So one of the things that has been an interesting experiment for me is getting students to engage in group projects online. And what I've had to do when I do that, we use WebEx in in the MUS, Montana State University system. And so making sure that students understand how to utilize WebEx has been an important part of it. If I create groups, I have to meet with each group online. and talk them through the process of recording a video, how to do a group presentation. But one of the things that's been a positive outcome of creating those types of opportunities is the online students have identified that they feel a sense of connection with their peers, that they feel a sense of connection with each other, and that they start to get that sense that we're part of a community. And so even though it requires, again, that little bit of scaffolding, the outcomes have been really interesting to see in terms of student feedback. And then often what I do is I get them to watch each other's presentations, which again reinforces that sense of I'm not just a student alone on an online platform. I am a student who is engaged in this community. And the visual part of it creates definitely a higher elevated sense of that in a way that I found that discussion boards aren't able to do to the same level. And students tend to, in the feedback that I've received, tire of discussion boards if they're done week after week after week after week. And the metrics show that students, the things that they retain, the things that they take forward with them from your classes are the conversations, are the ways in which you engage with them, as well as opportunities to write. And one of the things that for me, I don't know why it took me so long to figure this out, but what I realized when I'm doing online instruction, I can have a guest speaker come from anywhere in the country that I know. And so I have invited guest speakers from places I've lived before, such as Kansas, when I worked in disability rights, when I worked in Virginia, as well as in-state speakers. And I'll invite them to come and speak online to my classes. And it creates a very real world context for addressing issues for students. And it allows them to engage with people who have expertise that's sometimes outside of my own, but allows them to start seeing kind of what the end game is. So if I can pick guest speakers who are in, say, aspirational careers for them, those guest speakers allow them to start thinking about and get excited about, this is where I want to go. This is what I want to do. This is an opportunity for me. And so that really allows that kind of momentum and that sense of investment to build. And then as an instructor, I really work carefully to craft how I present myself to students, to make sure that I'm consistent, that I'm perceived as level-headed, and that I also offer a lot of opportunities in terms of helping students understand how to manage the online system, but also that I utilize humor and an ability to offer them context about my own academic experiences to allow them to have a sense of, if they aren't successful, this is just a moment. This isn't an example of their overall academic experience. And then I've also identified students who will engage in assisting with peer modeling. And then you can create online demonstrations for classes. So I've worked with professors in other programs on the campus when I was doing e-learning instruction. And we would talk about how we could create videos for students to give them examples of various tasks in science classes and in some of the other classes, so that then students could go back to those videos and reiterate and learn the practice as they were working on applying that information in their own work. One of the things that's been kind of interesting is when I first came to this campus, one of the common practices was often utilizing student moderators to navigate discussion boards. And this can be a really good way for getting students to peer model, but you have to know the students and understand what their capabilities are and how comfortable they are navigating an online environment. And so I found that moderators can be a mixed bag unless you're willing to embed and create some sort of training for student moderators. So I always want to encourage faculty to not just engage in the practice of, I've split everyone into groups, they're going to take care of it. Make sure that you've offered guidelines and expectations for what that looks like. If you need to, how do you incentivize the moderators to engage in the class? What kind of boundaries do they have? What kind of railings are there for them? And are you as an instructor checking in on that and making sure that they're feeling motivated to participate in that? Because sometimes you'll get a student who has been given that type of responsibility, but that isn't necessarily where their strengths lie. And so unless you have a real sense of what that looks like, you have to be thoughtful and discerning about how to make it effective. So yeah, students like to give each other, engage with each other, but make sure that you're not just creating routine assignments week after week after week. Figure out ways to mix it up. Figure out ways to make the guest speaker the required assignment. Another suggestion that I always have for faculty is, if you're concerned about students engaging with your classes, create an extra credit, 5 points. If you turn in a brief summary of this week's class, I'm going to give you 5 points. Or, utilize your weekly presentations as a means to get students to provide, feedback, and they get 5 points for that. However you want to navigate that, there are ways that you can incentivize and ensure that students are engaging with those online classes in addition to the routine assignments that you provide for them. Because I'll hear a lot of instructors saying, I'm not sure when I do online presentations that students are engaging in this the way I want them to. One of the shifts that I've also done is I create a lot of interactive opportunities. I do a lot of WebExes that can be experienced synchronously and asynchronously. And so a student will come in on a Wednesday at 5:30. I will talk and do a lecture for an hour. About half the class typically attends, and then the other half will give me feedback later. And what you need to be aware of is, particularly for students who may not be familiar with the online environment, they'll be experiencing anxiety. But if you can get them so that they can start to reframe their capabilities around navigating an online environment, they will start to think that they can be engaged in this and be successful. And it's fascinating to see that some of this is generational. But what I always tell students that I work with is that when I first came to America, I was in my mid-20s, and my husband, who is from America, had talked to me about how I could communicate with my family via email. And I was in Wyoming at that time, and my answer to him was, what's an email? Because I really had no experience with computers or technology. I went through my bachelor's at a time when we used to pay people to write our thesis. And so for me, learning how to navigate this online environment, learning how to support students, there was a lot of things that I had to adapt to. But in allowing students to understand that, it disarms them and makes them realize that if someone who doesn't know what an email was is able to do it, then they are probably going to be able to manage it as well. And so it's really giving those students an opportunity to just think about, I can build on this. I can play around with this. There's going to be opportunities for me to get familiar. I don't front load too much for students when they're practicing getting used to an online class. But as the class progresses, I start to set up circumstances for them to experiment and try out things a little bit more. And so the other thing that you can do is, if you do videos, I do introductory videos for my classes every week. And I will get students and I'll talk about how we can engage in getting them excited before they do a test. And then often when the test is done, I'll post a video just telling students that they're doing a great job and how enthused I am for them. And that I'll also talk about how tests in the field that I work in aren't what define an effective practitioner. And so I'll talk about the fact that the scenario, how they respond to scenarios, how they talk about their context for working with people. I will reiterate some of those things are the ways that are important in terms of how do they engage, how do they associate themselves, and how will they work, once they get out into the field professionally. And then even online, I have worked to talk to students through how to take a break, how to have a stretch, what to do. If we're doing a WebEx or if they're reading, in my work, every day, I have a Fitbit. And my Fitbit tells me that I need to walk a certain amount of steps on the hour every hour. And I'll joke with the students about how when the robot overlords come, I'll be ready, because my Fitbit tells me to walk and I walk. But it's also been a good balance for me to make sure that I'm not getting fatigued sitting at my desk, that I'm not getting fatigued sitting at my computer, and talking to students about how do you manage that balance when you come home from work and you're sitting at your computer for 3 hours. Do you take breaks? Do you have a little stretch? Do you have a little walk, so that you can then regroup and come back refreshed to doing the work online? I reiterate those things for students all the time, because I want them to start thinking about that. I want them to create best practices, not only for themselves, but for the community that we all work in. And then verbal persuasion. So you can often I found that as a faculty member, I can convince learners that they can be successful in a task. Part of that is creating a degree of enthusiasm about the work that they're doing. And so as an English person, I know that there's certain cultural points of references for cheerleaders, but I almost contextualize myself without pom-poms as a cheerleader for students. When I demonstrate enthusiasm, when I tell them that they're making progress, they're moving things forward. When they do a big assignment at the end of the semester, I'll often give them video feedback, and it really creates that positive sense of connection with who I am as a faculty member. And it often, I found, results in students, then all those students enrolling in my next class the following semester or the following year, because they like that sense of continuity, and they like that sense of, here's this faculty member, they're engaged in my success, they're motivated for me, and then they become motivated for themselves. And this takes a little bit more work, but certainly initially it's very important, is making sure that you provide constructive, explicit feedback on assignments. One of the things that I found interesting is in the first semester when I was teaching a advanced psychiatric rehabilitation class, is I had a big research paper that I wanted students to do. And students' experiences when I got that final paper, the abilities were vastly different. And so about a third of the class wrote almost master's level research papers. A third of the class wrote fairly average, interesting papers. And then a third of the class used Wikipedia as their research source for the papers that they were writing. And I realized that I hadn't provided any scaffolding or information for them to develop those skills. And so what I did then the next time I taught that class is I broke the research paper into 4 chunks and had those chunks occur throughout the semester. And so they would do the introduction, the middle of the paper, and that was split into 2 chunks. So in this case, it was a psychiatric rehabilitation class. And so we had them talk about history, etiology, symptomatology, treatment, and practice. And I broke all those 4 things into 4 separate parts of the paper every 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks during the course of the semester. And then I gave them explicit feedback about each section of the paper and what they could do to remediate their work if they needed it. And if they were doing well, what they could do, actually just reinforce their success. And then at the end of the semester, they would have to submit to me the final paper. And if they had acted upon all of the feedback that I had given them, then they would get an A in that paper. And that's basically what I would say at the beginning of the class is, I'm going to give you this paper in 4 chunks. We are going to talk about research practices and how to prepare to do a final paper in addition to the content. And if you do it, you're going to get an A in this final paper. And it was amazing. Students really got vested in it. And in the class feedback, I would have students saying, I'm going to incorporate these practices into how I do papers in the future. And a lot of students who would start the class going, I don't know how to write a paper, will come out of it by the end going, okay, I kind of get it now. I think I'm able to move this forward. And so using those opportunities for affirmation and instruction was really helpful to start building those students' sense of self-efficacy. And normalizing the challenges that students navigate around and making sure that students understand that you're invested in them, that you believe in them. is an important way to move forward. Okay, so the one thing that's important to be aware of is self-efficacy isn't that you're flattering students all the time, that you're making them feel good about themselves. It's making sure that students feel that they can be competent, that they're capable. And so you can give students constructive feedback that identifies issues as long as you're giving them the means to address them. And then making sure that students understand the technology that they're navigating, making sure that they understand when to submit things, how to look for deadlines, stuff like that. I've also sometimes, if I'm doing a discussion board and there's certain themes that I notice, I will do a video to the entire class talking about if I want to reinforce those themes, or if I notice that there's something that I'm maybe concerned about on a more global context that I want them to be thinking about to move things forward. And so that means I'm not necessarily calling out one student and saying, you should be doing this differently, you should be thinking about this differently. Instead, I'm having this global conversation with the class about, let's think about this issue. How can we address this? Are we being thoughtful? Are we being discerning? And it creates an opportunity for a different sense of narrative about it, because students don't feel like, well, they're calling out me specifically. They're thinking, instead it's, I want to get better. I want to engage in this. That's something for me to think about. How can I do this better? And if you're explicit, this often allows students to build that sense of mastery. Providing warm-up problems, guided practice, shows students, what they need to do to be able to start to develop that sense of mastery. And making sure that students have that ability to kind of build upon their skill sets as they progress through the semester. What I've noticed in a lot of online classes is that there's this continuity. So faculty offer up an opportunity, and it's the same opportunity over and over and over again during the course of the semester without any sense of building upon it. And sometimes I'll teach classes where students don't necessarily get the greatest grades at the beginning of the semester, but because they're allowed to build on their skills and because they're allowed to start to develop a sense of who they are and what they're capable of, they become very vested by mid-semester into, I'm going to push myself up. I'm going to try and work towards getting that B or that A. What can I do? I'm also not somebody who's not averse to throwing in a couple of extra credit opportunities for students, because it motivates students, they're interested. And then if there's a point that I really want to drive home, I'll use those extra credit opportunities as a way of doing that. Okay, so that is all I have to say about that. And I'm a little earlier than I anticipated. So does anyone have any questions for me?
Feel free to either enter questions into the chat, or you can come off mute if you'd like to ask any questions.
I have a small question. I am an instructor at Ames Community College up in Greeley, Colorado. And what I've noticed from a lot of your really wonderful advice is that much of it can also be applied to a classroom teacher. And so, for example, the celebratory rituals and the pump up, the test pump up, thank you for giving such a great example of that. But things like celebratory rituals and feedback, how do I shift from classroom teacher mode, where I'm telling this to students in person and registering their feedback as I'm talking to them, to doing it online? Should it generally be video feedback, email feedback? I mean, how do I transfer these skills?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we as faculty have is that we like the reciprocal relationship you have when you have that in-person context. And it can be very difficult to make the shift. Like, I remember when COVID happened, I taught an online class, and I did talk to one of my colleagues about how it feels like I'm talking into the void sometimes. And then at the end of the semester, I got the student feedback, and a lot of them were like, the feedback was really positive, but I had a Sally Fields, you like me, you really like me moment, because I wasn't getting that immediate feedback. So part of the challenge is, how do you create the energy when it's just you and you're recording a video? I do understand what you're saying. And for me, that was something that I really had to figure out how to navigate, because you don't necessarily always have those reciprocal opportunities, but you just have to kind of assume that they're out there being receptive to it. Yeah, it's not necessarily intuitive initially, but you do kind of work through it a little bit.
Thank you.
You can do the WebExes. So I do often do WebExes where I allow students to come in and I'll do an online lecture. But I also do have videos that I just post on a week-to-week basis where I'm in my office, and people walking by are probably like, wow, that's a really strange sound coming from there. But I've adjusted to it. Okay, and somebody said, how do you scale this in a shorter term class such as a winter term? So I have taught shorter term classes. I do think you still have to scale. And so say, for example, you're teaching a 2-week class. What I would do is make sure that you're scaling the first week of classes so that you're creating that opportunity to offer the instruction, offer the expectations with regards to what they're going to be doing, you know, in the second week. And so in some classes, I've known people do it really intensively, where they do an assignment a day. Just make sure that students are doing lesser graded assignments that first week, but getting a lot of explicit feedback about the expectations of the assignments. And then in the second week is when you kind of push it a little harder. In my instruction, when I teach on a longer basis, I found that I offer the first couple of weeks is when I really scale things so students can develop those competencies. I do a lot of work in the middle of the semester. And then I also then tend to scale off in the last couple of weeks, because I found that students tend to start focusing on, I'm going to do the exam. Then they're not always as engaged online in those last couple of weeks. And so I'm thoughtful about that. But when it's a more intensive session, I make sure that I'm doing it first week, lots of instruction, lots of video interactive opportunities. Second week, I go heavier on the assignments and start upping the grades and the expectations of those students. I don't know if that's helpful, but I don't teach as many short-term classes, but I have done that, and that's kind of how I do that. Okay. And then, oh, the cheerleader analogy. Yeah, it's really, really funny because I am British, needless to say. So, you know, being a cheerleader isn't something that necessarily comes naturally to me, but I love marching bands. I love cheerleaders. I think it's a good way to get students engaged. If you're excited, they start to feel like, okay, I can, you know, and it isn't always matched by students in terms of how they respond to you, but in terms of how they start to internalize that. It's always interesting to me because you have to have more energy than they do. And that's one of the challenges of online instruction, is you're bringing it. And sometimes you'll get students who are real quiet. They might not seem as if they're engaging in it, but if you're enthusiastic, they start to internalize that. And over time, they start to become more motivated and engaged. And I've seen that in my practice over and over and over again. So I can honestly say that that's part of it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'd love to follow up with you as well. You had mentioned about feedback, and I think the interesting thing about that is how we give feedback and the modality with which we give that feedback to the students. Have you noticed differences in responses or student, I guess, going back to self-efficacy, are you seeing students performing better with different modalities, whether it's written, whether it's verbal, whether it's video? I'm just curious if you have kind of any context for that process.
It's interesting because it depends on the types of students. Graduate students don't seem to care as much. You can give them written feedback, you can give them video feedback. Because in general, graduate students are more self-directed, I found that I don't have to craft the feedback for them as much. But for undergraduate students, yeah, when it comes to like the papers that I've split into chunks, I would give them explicit written feedback. But when it came to like thematic issues such as discussion boards, stuff like that, I would give them video feedback because they responded positively to video feedback. Particularly, like, I found that in the middle of the semester when students start to wane, the video feedback is a good way to get them to come back to re-engage in the class. So I can't speak for all the other, all of you and your experiences, but I found that there are times in the semester, like in Montana in the winter, that second half of the winter, getting students to engage can sometimes be challenging because they're getting tired of it, the snow, you know what I mean? And so figuring out how to utilize that kind of cheerleader energy is important when I give feedback to kind of re-energize them and re-enthuse them for the class.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point as well about the types of students. Most of my teaching experience has been at the community college level, and the cheerleader analogy is what I've used, and that generally works. Video feedback also, but yeah, I think that understanding the type of students and kind of their background ahead of time is certainly useful in that. Anyway, thank you, much appreciated.
Yeah, and I worked at a community college for about 3 years prior to working at VCU and at Montana State University Billings. And so and even here, I found that you really have to make sure that you're creating different types of modalities to utilize in offering instructing students so that they can start to feel that sense of, yeah, I'm capable. I don't use any peer feedback models. That's a good question. I have used peer feedback models. When I was at the community college level, I did. But I haven't really utilized that as a routine practice since I've been at MSU Billings. So generally, but I guess part of it is because I used to. Now when I do create the videos that I have done with students, I really create a context for students about how they can provide feedback to each other, what the ground rules are. And then I'll also sometimes I typically do a WebEx with students where I ask students what their expectations of ground rules are, how they would navigate that, so that they can start to develop some sense of autonomy about how they provide communication to each other, as well as to me. And then in the middle of the semester, and this is something I didn't mention, I send out an anonymous brief 5-minute survey and ask students, how's the class going? What could we be doing? What's working? What isn't working? How do you feel about it? And I will say the feedback is mixed. I probably get about if I have a class of 25 students, about 5 to 10 students do it because it's anonymous. But it has offered me at times useful insights about, is there too much of one thing and not enough of another? And because it's anonymous, students are willing to engage in that. And it has allowed me to kind of adapt my practice, because some semesters students love a discussion board, weirdly, and then some semesters they hate them. And so I have to be kind of thoughtful about, what types of students am I serving? At MSUB, we have a lot of non-traditional students. And so, we're not just dealing with students who are coming through the K through 12 system. In my classes, certainly, it's about a 50-50 split. And so students, expectations of what school looks like varies wildly. Any other questions? Well, I really appreciate how engaged you guys have been. It's really been a lovely opportunity to talk with everyone. You're also welcome to reach out to me at MSU Billings if you have any further questions. I've often found when I talk to people, a week later, they're like, dang, I wish I'd asked that, or I'd thought of that. Feel free to shoot me an email. You can find me by looking up Paula McMahon, MSU Billings. And I'm always interested in talking to faculty about how to build that sense of self-efficacy. I worked as an e-learning fellow at MSUB for the best part of about 2 years and really looked at how do we look at different types of instruction in different class formats. And I recognize that, it can be challenging if you work in a different alternative format to get students to start to build that sense of self-efficacy. So I'm always happy to talk to people about that. Okay, thank you guys.
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful session. And like you said, I can see the cheerleader coming out and that humor coming out in your presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you all for attending. If you have any feedback, please reach out on that form that is posted into the chat. And again, thank you so much.
It was
Excellent. This